Hi, everyone. So, I'm going to be talking about my research, which is a systematic review of food justice as it relates to El Paso. I've looked at about 15 studies so far, and I'm going to be giving an overview about what food justice is, why it matters, and some of the major themes and findings within this literature. So, before we get started, I just want to give a few definitions that are often used within this literature. The first is food justice, which is a social movement that's largely rooted in environmental justice, and it's focused on mending the inequitable distribution of food access. Food insecurity is the lack of consistent access to enough food for a healthy, active life. A food desert is a zip code or an area with a high amount of residents that are food insecure or is devoid of a supermarket or other food retailer that carries affordable and nutritious foods. Food sovereignty is the people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, as well as their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So, the food justice movement started in response to increasing food insecurity in many places, especially places that were low income and had high rates of minorities. Additionally, food justice literature also tended to include the convergence of food studies and alternative agriculture, which encompasses local, slow, organic, and other attempts to create more sustainable food with an ultimate goal towards food sovereignty. Some of the major findings of food justice literature include the evidence that has been found of racial and income disparities when it comes to food access, and yet only some studies have really dug into the consequences of living in this reality. Also, even though low income communities and people of color do not have as much access or tend to not have as much access to supermarkets and fresh foods, they do have more fast food establishments per capita, which leads to a lot of the obesity that we see, along with the availability of packaged foods and really processed foods that are available in smaller grocery stores, convenience stores, bodega type stores that we see here in El Paso. Much of the literature also explores the connection between food and cultural identity. So, this is where food studies kind of makes its way into food justice literature. And literature is often also centered around community, urban, and kitchen gardens in their efforts to address food insecurity and sovereignty. And food justice as a movement is scrutinized sometimes for relying too much on the market rather than the state to fix this issue, which is a neoliberalist practice, according to Alison Alkin. So, why exactly does it matter if people don't have enough access to nutritious foods? It matters because not having enough access to these foods is actually linked to both malnutrition and obesity, as well as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, etc., and the economic consequences that result from dealing with this kind of disease over time. And this is even more concerning for a community like El Paso that is already marginalized in so many ways. So, the Healthy Food Advisory Committee formed in 2009 to address the health impact of the retail availability and prevalence of fresh food in Texas. And they found that Texas had the second highest rate of food insecurity in the nation, with over 3 million people with very low or low food insecurity. A quarter of the state's children live in food insecure households. Two-thirds of Texas adults were either overweight or obese. And they did find evidence that weekly supermarket sales and income are not equally distributed across Texas. And to conclude the article, the committee did push for a sustainable health food initiative in Texas, and they also identify financing options, recommendations, and anecdotal evidence about what worked for other states to help us with fresh food availability for all. Now I'm going to go over some of the major findings of food access and food justice in El Paso. One of the major studies that was published here is called Food for Every Child. And it's a food access study done by the Food Trust and the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. And they used GIS mapping software to map out the supermarkets throughout all of El Paso to measure food access. And they found that even though El Paso is actually among the fastest growing metropolitan areas as of 2017, we have fewer supermarkets per capita than most major cities. The study also measured perceptions of the food environment in El Paso, and in regard to food insecurity, perceptions turned out to be almost 3 times as high for us as compared to the rest of the country. Colonias, or unincorporated communities on the outskirts of the city, are some of the most insecure food areas of the border, and there were a few articles on this topic. And a 2012 study showed that 64% of Mexican origin children in the US Mexico border region reported low or very low food security. Low nutritional requirements were met overall, and they actually had a greater calorie, fat, and sugar intake overall, which is a huge cause of obesity. And to conclude my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the gaps in literature according to the scholars, which include the impact of policy on food access, which is something that I have never seen in any article, and I think it would be really interesting to tap into that. I have seen some exploration of the impact of residing in a food desert, but Walker, who did a systematic review of about 100 food justice studies and food access studies, does call for this, and this was also in 2010. So maybe there has been more literature published since then on the exploration of the impacts, but that's something to keep in mind. The third is that scholars should shift back to focusing on worker exploitation within food systems as they did when the food justice movement had just begun in around the early 2000s. In terms of future directions, a focus from community to analyses of larger campaigns that fight for food justice is being seen among the latest publications. Also, examinations of efforts to address GMOs, pesticides, and improving wages for workers. Third is a linking with food justice, with migration, prison reform, and peasant movements in the global south who are also fighting for food justice. And finally, recommendations include mixed methods research studies for the study of food deserts with a participatory research approach. So that is my presentation on food justice. Thank you so much for listening and have a great one.